So I think it begins in, like a lot of things, with changing people's perceptions of certain institutions. So I think when there's a narrative that says, hang on, this is where we typically get our information, but this is a compromised source. So pointing to all of those things, external influence, out of touch with reality, elitist, those words start getting thrown about and not accountable to the people, as we've seen with some of the rhetoric coming out of the US. And it was similar, I think, in our case.
Welcome to Development Dialogues, a podcast series bringing together experts from research and policy to answer questions that are key to addressing today's most complex global development challenges. We'll discuss how the latest research in development economics can inform strategies to fight poverty, reduce inequality, and drive inclusive economic growth. Development Dialogues is a collaboration between Yale's Economic Growth Center and VoxDev. Hello, and welcome to Development Dialogues. I'm your host, Catherine Cheney. In this episode, we'll tackle a question that feels more urgent than ever. How do we ensure that facts and evidence still matter in policymaking? This question is particularly timely as the rise of populist politics around the world has led policymakers to rely less on research and expertise as political narratives increasingly prioritize emotion and identity over facts. And our conversation happens in the midst of the unprecedented dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Thousands of staff have been laid off, critical development programs have been halted, and the future of U.S. foreign assistance remains in limbo. Joining us are three experts who have spent their careers navigating these challenges from different angles. Rory Stewart has served as a UK minister across multiple departments, including the Department for International Development, now the FCDO. He's also senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and the co-host of the hugely popular podcast The Rest is Politics, where he brings an insider's take on government decision-making. Stefan Dercon is a professor of economic policy at Oxford and the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, with extensive experience advising governments in the UK and beyond. His book, Gambling on Development, explores why some countries manage to use evidence for progress while others fall into stagnation. And Trudi Makhaya, former economic advisor to South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, has worked at the highest levels of government to craft policy in complex and politically charged environments. With experience spanning government, business, and consulting, she brings a grounded, real-world view of the political and economic trade-offs that policymakers must navigate. Together, we'll explore why evidence-based decision-making is under threat, how policymakers can still find entry points for evidence in environments that are resistant to it, and the future of global development in the midst of this changing political landscape. Rory, I want to start with a question for you, building on some insights you shared recently on your own podcast, The Rest is Politics, which I think perfectly captures this moment we're in. So a listener wrote in with a question asking, would you agree that we're not so much in an age of post-truth as we are in an age simply where truth as an objective standard of correctness has no bearing on what people choose to believe? And you responded that evidence-based policy doesn't really work in a world where nobody actually believes there is any evidence. Can you expand on the challenges evidence-based policy faces in this era?
Listen, we're talking just at the moment where the announcement has come that USAID has been dismantled and disintegrated, and thousands of staff have lost their jobs and are being brought back from their international postings, and many, many international NGOs have lost their funding. And of course, Stefan was the chief economist at DFID when I was a minister and then the Secretary of State. And we worked in a very, very different universe. And as you say, the great buzzword of the time was evidence-based policymaking. What it meant, certainly for us and the UK Department for International Development, which was then pushing towards spending 0.7% of our GNI on international aid, so nearly $20 billion a year, were very, very significant, big research programs and very sort of well thought through, but probably quite complicated and burdensome processes where every program was put through logical frameworks and strategic assessments and assessed by external advisors. And all of it was supposed to be working around the question of how to spend each pound or dollar most effectively in order to achieve our objective, which was then supposed to be focusing on helping the extreme poor around the world. And perhaps the most dramatic example of this was the work that was being done around direct cash transfer, something that I was initially very skeptical about and something that I then became increasingly enamored with when I joined a nonprofit called Give Directly. And that was a particularly extreme example of this because that was particularly conducive to the use of randomized control trials, which is like a medical trial where you have a control group and a treatment group and you give cash to one group and you don't give it to another and you measure it over time and then you use academics to then come in and measure results. And that world seems very, very distant now because I fear now that that whole language now sounds very pompous, very elitist, very out of touch. And we're in a political environment in which people don't have much patience for professorial types talking about, detailed randomized control trials. Certainly on my threads on X, what used to be Twitter, basically, the story is we don't want to give money to this bunch of foreigners. They're all corrupt. It's all a waste of time. Let's focus on what we're doing back home. And if that's the story, it's quite difficult to break through that with a comparison of a particular nutrition program in Ghana against another program in Rwanda.
In that period, working in development, it felt also quite an uncontested space in the sense that geopolitics was easier. Societies were not as divided as they are now in the rich donor countries. And so the space to actually then say, well, let's just do it as carefully as we can was just much, much bigger. But it is not probably the first time in history that fact-based policymaking is just fundamentally under threat because stories, narratives are so easily told and it's such hard work to try to unpick them. One of the things that I always tell people, if you want to give, like a minister, like Rory was, advice, try to understand how they think. What is their mental model? How do they think? And then look for an entry point. Now, of course, if the mental model becomes so crooked and so away from anything, where do you start? Where is your entry point? Where can you actually begin to do something with it? To be honest, I experienced it to some extent as the last minister I had to advise, someone called Liz Truss, who was suffering from the same thing, is that ideas and ideology, as long as they were hers, it's fine, and nobody should ever try to correct them. Even if you argued something very carefully, there is no entry point. And that's really where the problem lies. You can only advise, you can only bring evidence if there is an entry point. And if the underlying mental model is so away from any factual reality, well, where do you start? But my general sense is, though, and I tell our students it as well, we'll have to find these entry points again. Where can we begin to correct some of these fallacies? We can do it by big debates, but it's probably going to be bit by bit unpacking this again and unpicking it and finding entry points.
Trudi, I want to bring you into this. So we've talked about how do you find those entry points? And I would expand the conversation to say entry points not just to present evidence, but also to communicate uncertainty, because sometimes things are uncertain.
Yeah, and I think you're spot on in terms of what you say about a world where evidence is in doubt, and also where if you present evidence, people expect a high degree of certainty in a way that you can't always promise. So I am an economist by training. I've worked in various areas of policy. And in 2018, I was appointed as economic advisor to President Ramaphosa. I don't have a political career. And in South Africa, advisors come from diverse backgrounds. So for the president, there were about 7 or so advisors when I was there. From 2018 to 2023, we had a mixed team with all of those 3 elements: retirees, politicians, professionals. And so that in itself creates a bit of a dynamic because different people draw from different sources of wisdom when they advance arguments. So, you can bring evidence and there'll be other parts or other members of the team who are advising on different subjects, of course, but would still have a say in your portfolio, who are persuaded more by how does this advance our political narrative. during a tricky time in terms of our economic development. So we had very stagnant economic growth. When I joined, we had taken over from a previous administration led by Jacob Zuma. I think it's all very well documented in terms of the governance and corrupt lapses of that administration and the way it had undermined a lot of state capacity. And part of that undermining of state capacity is that those parts of government that generate research, or broadly the state. So if you think about National Treasury Department, trade and industry, even some of the more operational line ministries, those people who generate evidence in those kinds of departments had been marginalized. So there was that context. The central bank, also another major generator of economic policy data, also sidelined or subject to a lot of aggressive rhetoric in the way it conducts itself. So marginalized in a few senses. Marginalized in the sense that the arguments would always be dismissed with the usual, this is neoliberal, externally influenced, Washington consensus, etc. It would also be marginalized in that in some of the corrupt acts that were happening, decisions wouldn't actually be taken in formal structures. People would go, have the proper meetings, present evidence, have arguments, and then there would be a bad conversation where the actual decisions get taken. So in a way, after a while, they become a bit irrelevant to the whole policy discussion.
I think what you're saying is so interesting because, of course, this is not a purely South African phenomenon.
Sure.
We're now looking in Europe and the United States at the rise of new forms of government, which are more populist in tone. And we're beginning to see elements of democratic backsliding. And one of the things we're struggling to understand, and maybe South Africa is a route into this, is that the change from a evidence-based, more rules-based system to a more informal, even more corrupt system doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't necessarily happen with a military coup and tanks rolling in. It happens subtly within the government. And as you say, meetings can continue, conversations can continue, but suddenly those meetings no longer matter and decisions are made somewhere else and voices change. So can I tempt you, Trudi, for a second to sort of step out of the South African context and think about a more general model, whether you're talking about the Americas or Europe or Africa, for some of the signs of how these regimes begin to undermine traditional policymaking?
I think it begins, like a lot of things, with changing people's perceptions of certain institutions. When there's a narrative that says, hang on, this is where we typically get our information, but this is a compromised source. So pointing to all of those things, external influence, out of touch with reality, elitist, those words start getting thrown about and not accountable to the people, as we've seen with some of the rhetoric coming out of the US. And it was similar, I think, in our case, where there are these policy mandarins who don't understand anything, who've lost touch, and we are coming with a more organic, bottom-up response to these questions. So I think that's one thing that then creates doubt in people's minds. But I think the second thing is that there's then a very strong network that forms where people really know how they work together in these informal structures. In our case, we had a couple of business people centered around a particular family, but I think a bit more broadly than that, who had a direct access to the very top of government, and then who can create these structures where they would all go to the different meetings with a pre-approved, pre-understood playbook that is developed elsewhere outside of the policy development process. And sometimes I think we underestimated how sophisticated that playbook could be, that there's actually an alternative policy agenda that's been crafted elsewhere that then gets fed into the system and the bureaucracy. And so in South Africa, we call it state capture. There's a bit of debate around that term, but I think that's essentially when there is this alternative parallel source of legitimacy that then drives all the decisions.
So, Trudi, what you're telling us, and about South Africa and the state capture, and it's actually a well-documented, as you said, move from the 1990s, where this wasn't the case, to the Zuma period, where this is happening. But it's also, I must say, it is really interesting to see in South Africa how you try to begin to respond to it. And I see this in other countries as well. And it may give us lessons. For once, we actually have lessons from countries that weren't that well run, that are trying to restructure a bit. And I think the West could learn a few things from this. And so the one thing, and it links to our conversation on evidence, is that there's quite a lot of documented evidence around the emergence of pockets of effectiveness. If the whole system breaks down, you can begin to reinvest in a few places that begin to function well. And there actually say the presidency in South Africa and the teams around you, including you, where you were working, Trudi, you can recognize it, where there's a rediscovery of facts and evidence, and try to do things in an environment where the storytelling and all the narratives and the accusations that you're all neoliberals or terrible, it's actually quite present. And so we've seen this in other countries because, I'm the optimist about lots of these countries that were looking a bit like what South Africa went through, is that we see in a lot of African countries, Asian countries, where we managed to get out of it. And it very much comes with small pockets of effectiveness that manage to make sure they hold on and then they can begin to expand.
Part of the problem, though, that I feel as a politician is the question of time and the impatience of the public. So let's bring it from South Africa back to the UK. Keir Starmer's government probably feels that they've got rid of this ideological right-wing government and they've come in and they're being more evidence-based and they're listening to civil servants and they're setting up proper processes. But of course, his net favorability rating is terrible. They're extremely unpopular in the polls and everybody's getting frustrated and saying, what are you doing? You're not doing anything. The economy's not growing. And so I guess, Trudi, that must have been an issue for you. I mean, even if you felt, look, in many, many ways, we've improved things a great deal since Jacob Zuma was here, there will also be many ordinary South Africans during that 5-year period who weren't feeling the urgent change in their daily lives, who were feeling frustrated. I guess it would be the same if I talk to, Jake Sullivan and Biden's team. He would talk about all the wonderful work that they did over 4 years, and we go into an election and he loses the election. And all this lovely evidence-based policy and all their thoughtfulness counts for nothing.
Exact same dynamic. If you look at those 5 years, a lot of the anger and the discontent manifest over a very long time and is even reflected in the elections of 2024, where the ANC came in at 40% of the vote and lost dominance for the first time. Arguably, if things happened in a very linear and immediate way, you'd say that should have happened to the Zuma administration. But, there's this lag effect. And it also plays out in that when you're trying to do all of the reforms that we're trying to implement, there would often be a short-sighted comparisons. So, for instance, the energy system, the damage to the energy system that happened before really became manifest during our time in government, during the Ramaphosa administration, where you started really seeing significant power cuts. But then it becomes the problem of the moment. You're doing these reforms with experiencing power cuts, and it's never linked to the overall story of how we got to that moment. So a lot of the pain that people feel in terms of economic indicators, job losses, etc., it gets blamed on the administration in place. And when you try to explain and try to craft a careful argument to say, look, this is what happened to the power system. This is when investment should have happened 7 years ago. This is when maintenance should have been done 5 years ago. And this is why this is happening today. It just doesn't land in popular discourse. It's your problem and you get punished for it.
It strikes me that one of the tensions that we're living with feels like a tension between the authoritarian, more populist right saying we are dynamic, we're disruptors, we can get things done. Whereas the old, more centrist, technocratic, evidence-based civil servants are portrayed as being too slow, too process-driven, too cowardly, too tied up and handcuffed by law and norms. And there's a great appetite from the public for these kind of big figures to come in who are going to smash everything up and get moving and get the energy and dynamism back in. Do you recognize this as being something that you see in domestic development policy?
So there is definitely that element. And for me, it's actually this, what you definitely describe in this technocratic, evidence-based work. It's typically quite long-term. And actually, it is also a failing of, I think, a lot of the advisors and the academics that provide this advice. They keep on forgetting that the short run is the biggest enemy of the long run. That basically you keep on having to think, what is the constraint I have here? And in fact, the one thing I've learned, and I wish I knew, and by the time I was actually still in UK government, it's to learn to much better understand. If you give advice based on evidence, you have to build in these political constraints. This kind of here and now. And even if it's not the best possible one. So don't try to give the perfect technocratic solution, but actually begin to think about it. What's the best I can do that is as evidence-based as I can, but taking into account that I have to take the people with me, that I have to actually make the progress. And it's something I find really interesting and worth working on. And it's really interesting in the development side. So I wrote a few things around this, and I get all these IMF officials asking me now, come and give some courses on it, because they like to do these reforms that sound very good in the long term, but in the short term are usually implausibly difficult for populations to accept. And so you need to get the technocratic people in the development space to begin to understand there is a reality here and now that's political, that's contextual, and you better take it into account, because otherwise all that evidence-based advice will lead us nowhere.
You mentioned, Stefan, that if you want to give a minister advice, you have to understand how they think. And of course, that was a very different experience with Rory Stewart than with Liz Truss. Can you just share any insights on how did you find entry points when doing so became more difficult? Because that might help us connect with what's happening in the US right now, where certainly those entry points are hard to find.
Well, let me pick up what Rory alluded to on cash transfers. Okay, so, DFID was one of the organizations that early on, well before 2010, was actually beginning to be believers even with limited evidence, and we wanted to do this. It sounded like right thing to do, and actually paid for a lot of the research that in the end we've now built up on it. But of course, I was a chief economist when we had George Osborne's in the UK austerity budgets in the early 2010s after the financial crisis. And we were clearly told by political advisors, special advisors, they called, oh no, we can't do cash transfers anymore, even if you tell me the evidence is there, because we're going to take cash benefits away from elderly people in the north of England. How can we ever justify that we would do it in Pakistan? And then we had to look for the entry point. And so we had to recast, and that's before Rory's time, recast to actually say, at least in humanitarian settings, where it's such an urgency to get the things as effectively as possible, can we do it? And so we were allowed early on to do it. So that's the entry point, to say, okay, the evidence is bigger, but the entry point was humanitarian. And over the years, to be really frank, we tried to open that space further, including meetings we had with Rory when he came in, and tried to convince him to go broader.
As a minister and then a Secretary of State responsible for ultimately signing off on these programs, and the way the system works is that they write a business case for, let's say, spending 150 million through the World Bank on education in Ethiopia, and ultimately I need to sign it off or not sign it off. It's very, very difficult, oddly, to convince someone with evidence. I'm trying to sort of explain why that's problematic. Let's say, for example, I look at a program doing something in Zimbabwe or something in Malawi, and I read the business case as the minister, and it seems to me a little bit unconvincing. And I start asking, well, why are they spending exactly so much on the shelters? Why are the overheads, 20%, not 10%? Have they counted the overheads correctly? How much exactly does this NGO know about working in this part of Malawi? What type of shelter are they building? Quite quickly, I can begin causing problems for myself with this business case. Quite quickly, I can develop doubts. And in my experience, it was very difficult for civil servants to overcome those doubts, often because the person briefing you is not the person implementing the program. The person briefing you is often a junior in the capital city who's been given this business case by Malawi or Zimbabwe, and they've read it, but they don't know much more about it than you do. So you have a relatively young civil servant trying to argue with you. The only way really in which actually you can get these things through, unfortunately, is through trust and personal relations often. So often for me, it would be being able to talk to the woman running the educational program in Lebanon. And she says to me, no, Rory, we're going with UNICEF, not Save the Children, because the Save the Children office is less strong here. And the UNICEF office has 15 Arabic speakers, and they've been here 50 years, and they've got good relations with the Lebanese government, and trust me. And I say, oh, okay. Or Stefan comes in to see me and says, look, Rory, I know that you think this program in Malawi or Zimbabwe is rubbish, but I promise you it's actually one of our better programs. And because I like and trust Stefan, I'm like, okay, fine.
Rory, you have to just recognize that you were very different ministers than most, and actually taking the time to think. This is a joy for someone to try to provide advice, including on evidence, because you took the time to think through it. Most of the time, I found with ministers, and at the moment I'm very involved in Pakistan, advising Prime Minister and a series of ministers on economic reforms. The most entry points I find when using evidence is fear. if I tell them, look, the evidence tells us this really doesn't work, or this will cause you trouble. And actually, ministers often in the time they have, they're more susceptible often in terms of, this maybe we shouldn't do it because of that. I often say evidence can be more powerful to try to stop doing things than actually getting you to do things. And it's something we have to recognize. Take an example, the evidence based on microcredit, that for the very poorest, it's maybe not the best one. That was actually one of the few cases we really managed to stop in deficit, say, based on evidence. We shouldn't really do this. This is not the way to do it.
So, Trudi, I wonder if you can expand on any particular examples navigating some of these constraints that we've been discussing.
I think the most dramatic time, of course, for all of us during the period that I was economic advisor was during COVID. Immediately, we had responses in terms of tax breaks and thinking about how we really alleviate the burden. But then it got to a point where we needed to be a bit more or much more evidence-based to think about what are the most impactful things that we can do. And it was clear we needed some form of transfer to households. And so a case really had to be made because, like many countries, there's also a bit of a pushback whenever there's cash transfers, say people are going to waste it, it's not going to be useful, etc. So really painting the picture around how people, particularly those with informal and tenuous livelihoods, have lost access to those livelihoods, getting surveys done to show impact on household access to food, household access to income, and really painting the picture of how the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns have affected how people can live. And then using that to make a case for a new grant that is available to all unemployed adults at that time, and to show this is the impact it's likely to have in terms of reducing hunger, ensuring that the impacts are minimized. And at the same time, evidence to really tweak and give options around the different levels at which you could have what we eventually call the COVID-19 SRD grant. So different levels of it, different ways of targeting it to different kinds of households, and then eventually converging on a number, 350 Rand at the time, on eligibility, anyone without any other source of income, and then really having that as policy. So I think at every step of the way, a lot of our arguments were supported by great research. We had researchers from local university, UCT. We had researchers from international universities, Oxford and Duke. So really collaborative, multiple perspectives to really show what this would look like in terms of rollout.
I mean, we're obviously talking at the moment where USAID is being dismantled and international aid in general is being dismantled. One of the big problems, of course, is that there was a huge amount wrong with these development agencies. And so the strange problem that we have is that suddenly somebody like me, and I imagine in different ways Stefan and Trudi, are coming to the defense of the international development system. And then people are saying, no, hold a second. A few months or years ago, you made some really serious criticisms of these agencies. So don't you really agree with Elon Musk when he says a lot of this stuff was wasteful and stupid and daft? And of course, that's part of the problem here. How do you find a way of saying, of course, there's a lot of stuff that was wrong. Of course, a lot of these criticisms are completely valid. But I still think, we can do some really good international development work. And I think it's worth wealthy countries putting money into international development. And of course, we had different versions of this. There's the critique of the left and there's the critique of the right. The critique of the right is it's none of our business. Keep the money at home. Charity begins at home. It doesn't matter. These people don't matter. The critique of the left was, these people are engaged in white savior complex. There are too many international NGOs. There's not enough localization. There's not enough sensitivity. They're not listening enough to local governments. But both of those critiques combined to discredit the international aid system. Either from the right, it's a ludicrous, liberal, woke waste of money, or from the left, it's a neo-colonial, oppressive, wasteful project that just feeds. So sustaining the center ground, which says, of course, there's something in all these critiques, and yet we still think it's worth us spending money on other people's countries and worth trying to provide good development programs and getting beyond our micro disagreements. I've been on the record arguing with Bill Gates and disagreeing about what the Gates Foundation is doing. Now, of course, in retrospect, I think, oh my goodness, what was I doing, right? I'm sort of giving succor to the enemy, right? Instead of arguing with Bill Gates, I should be teaming up with Bill Gates and arguing against people who are much, much more dangerous than whatever the tiny disagreements I have with him on the way in which he spends his foundation's money.
I hear you, Rory. While we all agree development needed some kind of reset, this was not what we had in mind. So, Trudi, Stefan, do you want to jump in on what's happening with USAID and to foreign aid more broadly and how that connects with this big question on the role of evidence-based policy in this moment and finding some kind of middle ground?
Obviously, I also see what's happening in the broader region on the continent where USAID is a significant part of budgets and development. In South Africa, it's not as significant. But what's interesting is that the work that they do here is actually good case studies of where things go right. So a lot of the work that's also linked to PEPFAR, which they've been administering in Southern Africa, really supporting good AIDS treatment projects that really ensure that people have access to antiretroviral medication. And also when you see the coordination that that program had with the national program and enabled a much bigger national program, it was almost the foundation and the seed of it, but the mostly massive local ownership. So you look at a project like that and you say, well, there is some good that's been done. And perhaps the argument is not all of these programs look like this. And so let's learn when something goes wrong and people learn and improve. You just don't stop supplying and shut everything down. So I think there's that element of really pointing to those areas. And there are many areas across the continent. Power Africa, electrifying the continent. Clear benefits to growth, to ending energy poverty, to prosperity, to an Africa that's actually a good trading partner and a good player in the global economy. Really hard to argue to say that Power Africa is some nefarious, neo-colonial project. So I think maybe elevating those examples is one way to try and win that battle. I think the other thing to also keep returning to is that a lot of where aid goes to today is around global public goods, climate, even pandemics. All of those issues are very difficult for any one nation to deal with, even rich nations. And often is the case that developing countries suffer the most with climate, haven't contributed the most. So there's really an argument to be made that however you feel, politically, ideologically about this, we can't get out of many of these problems without global cooperation, which includes aid.
Even though I worked in the sector, I was always quite critical, and I'm still actually quite critical of a lot of things, but it feels like shooting ourselves in the foot. But I do think that totally disapproving of the entire crazy disruption that's going on and so on, those of us that want to defend aid should also take as an opportunity, okay, well, how will we begin to rebuild it? And how will we begin to think again about it? And there's a couple of things that I do think we can do so much better, and maybe this is an opportunity. The first one, linking it to the evidence side. We've got a bit like the World Bank has the knowledge and the countries don't. The international community has the evidence and we'll come and tell you what to do. Take them on the journey. Work with these governments. Work with the governments in whether it's South Africa, Mozambique or Ethiopia. You just work with them and say, look, let's actually see ourselves that you're not being told by us this should be the one that you should be doing that has the highest rate of return. But let's work with you that you take you on a journey. Just treat them as if they are a government, just as I'm advising at the time Rory and trying to convince him of what I know of some of the evidence. Similarly, that we do it and persuade them. And it's related to it. There is one thing that the whole crisis with USAID brings out to the fore, which really should worry us a lot, but also as seen from the countries. And it's the following. Why is it that so many things that everybody senses in the countries and outside are purely amongst the most essential things? Why are they paid for by aid rather than prioritized in the countries themselves? And that actually is a little bit strange. I remember a very good experience I had in Ethiopia, which was a very self-empowered, very much ownership-based government that they had. And they said, look, we want to use aid for the things that we don't think are the most important things, but the most important things come from our own resources. And that's a model that it has to be an eye-opener. All this PEPFAR and vaccine payment, these are really, really good. But have we worked enough that they just become the normal thing that we first spent our resources in the countries? And then, find some slightly nicer to have with this all unreliable international community that we then can start working with. So I think we need to work with these countries also differently.
And of course, there is a political risk there, because once you do that, you're no longer able to provide that very powerful defense of programs which Trudi just provided. I mean, it's very helpful to say to the taxpayer in the US or the UK that you're paying for something completely essential, not that you're paying for something which is nice to have and around the margins. And I think the other thing that I've been so interested in here is that it seems as though many of the people who are speaking around the Trump administration fundamentally don't like the idea that they can be giving money to organizations that they don't fully control. So they have a profound problem, for example, with the idea of civil society. A lot of their stories are, we gave money to this NGO and it criticized us. This is absolutely outrageous. How can we be giving money to an NGO that criticizes us, right? And you can see this writ large with the documents that have now come out of the detailed proposals that were put to Ukraine, which were, we will continue to work with you, Ukraine, if you give us 50% of all your mineral revenues now and in the future, and total control over how you spend investment money that comes from those mineral resources has to be signed off by the US. So it's a model which, fundamentally very, very difficult to see this as an opportunity to re-energize international development if the model and the minds of the administration are that every dollar you give must require total loyalty to the United States, total control from the United States, total profit to the United States, so that you can justify to your taxpayer that none of this is altruistic, none of this is charitable. All the money must be used to benefit the American taxpayers.
But of course, this is the unfortunate extreme case of the current administration in the US. I'm still that old Europe is not necessarily going to be as crazy as this. But you raise, of course, a very good point. But I want to come back on this earlier point and saying, look, we undermine our defense of aid if you do what I do. But of course, I worry that for the last 60 years in northern Nigeria, we've paid for health programs where nothing is to be seen from permanently. You and I had long conversations about Malawi, remember? That there was a moment of saying, should we actually at some point stop giving aid to Malawi? Because there is nothing changing. And are we making ourselves so indispensable in these places that there's also no change? Now, I'm not saying there's an easy answer to it, but to come back to the kind of public opinion, and I wonder whether there isn't something about us trying to convince the median voter all the time and to kind of have the majority that everything. Most government spending has pockets of really people that can actually defend it. It is something that we're never going to get the whole population with it. And maybe we contribute to putting it too much in the news. Why can it not be something you find that a decent nation does? And you're not making it every moment again as something of public discourse. Of course, it doesn't help us with this, but it may well have helped us 10 years ago when we all wanted to debate as if we were going to sell it to all the great European or British publics around here.
Also, from an African perspective, there have been many times where there's a critique around this attempt to sell aid to the median voter, often then is presented in a way that catastrophizes the continent, paints it as perpetually helpless, etc. So I think there is something to be said to have a conversation about aid, which isn't about showing that starving child to appeal to everyone and just saying, actually, perhaps there's an audience that understands and gets this and sees the bigger picture, but we can't be trying to sell it in that sensational way to everyone.
I absolutely resonate with this. I mean, as a politician, of course, what my colleagues would often say to me is you need to explain why every pound of British development spending is actually in the interest of the United Kingdom. You need to explain that if you don't give them money, hundreds of millions of migrants will be crossing the Mediterranean and swarming the United Kingdom. If you don't give them money, you're all going to get Ebola. Of course, this is dishonest, right? We can't justify every pound of spending in this way. Yeah. The reality is probably we're not going to have hundreds of millions of migrants. We're not going to probably get Ebola. Some of this is altruistic, but then as Trudi says, you can't even overemphasize the altruism too. There's a difficult balance there too. The whole thing becomes very difficult. On the one hand, you don't want to catastrophize. You don't want to make all Africans seem like victims. On the other hand, you have to remind people that there is real extreme poverty on the Burundi border. And one of the reasons why you might be giving a cash transfer to a community is that these people are eating once every 2 days. They're sleeping on the floor. Their roof is leaking. They don't have any livestock. Their life expectancy is this. They're not in school. And if you don't remind people of that, why would they give any money, right? If you say everything's wonderful, Africa is a great success story, there's no catastrophes, there's no problems, it's all going in the right direction, then of course everybody doesn't give money. So getting the argument right is particularly difficult because international development takes place a very, very long way from the voter. If you talk about education or health inside Britain or the US, people can relate to it. Their children or grandchildren are in a school. They go to the hospital. They can sort of get a feeling of the reality around it. Okay, there's a lot that annoys them when they go to the hospital, but they also understand they need a hospital. So they think the money's wasted, but they don't want to cut the whole health budget. When you're talking about doing work on the Burundi-Rwanda border, you're talking about something so far away from people's imaginations. And that means that you can project all kinds of fantasies, positive, negative, catastrophes, success stories, wastes of money, fantastic transformations. But it's very unstable because there's no daily grounding of accountability. This isn't their country. They don't visit these places. They don't see them. They don't understand. And so it can flip in a second from one narrative to another because there's no reality there.
International aid has these two related problems. The one that Rory said, it's very far from you. And at the same time, it's public money. You know, there's a lot of distrust already about public money in the first instance. Governments everywhere, ordinary people find it very critical of it. It's a form of public spending. And that is public spending that is happening far away in a reality that they can't even fully imagine. And then, of course, they imagine it. And then the stories say, oh, it must all be wasted, it must all be corrupt, are then just amplified because it's far away. And so this is, again, comes back to it, is that increasingly, I think, if we can't make the basic point around some basic human decency, and then, of course, when we are spending it, really being as transformational as we can on the ground, but make the argument largely around human decency. It's something that a decent country does, and it finds it quite normal within its own historical setting to do something like that. Then we may be safer rather than trying to justify that it contributes to UK growth, that it is the best way of fighting climate change for ourselves. It's the best way to do all these things. It may do that, but that's the slippery slope that I don't want to go on. I don't think this age of disruption itself will continue. One of the things that policy making has to do at some point, it has to do an alternative. It can disrupt, but there will be pressure to do something. And it's these areas I want to keep an eye out for. There will be a moment that things need to be done, and there will be things happening where even the administration that thinks it's in control of everything will actually not be in control.
Well, there's never been a more difficult time for this work, but also never a more important time for this conversation. So Trudi, Stefan, Rory, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
That's all for this episode of Development Dialogues. If you'd like to learn more about the Economic Growth Center, you can visit egc.yale.edu, where you can sign up for the EGC newsletter. And if you'd like to learn more about VoxDev, head to voxdev.org, where you can sign up for the VoxDev newsletter for a weekly summary of the latest economic research. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and consider sharing it and leaving a rating and review. And look for the next installment of Development Dialogues wherever you get your podcasts.